They showed up at my gate with a flatbed truck, a removal order, and the kind of confidence you only see from people who believe they already won. They told me they were there to take away my junk. What they didn't know was that the junk sitting inside my hangar included a 1944 P-51 Mustang, a restored Navy trainer, and my father's old Sturman biplane, a piece of aviation history that had been in my family for decades. They thought they were dealing with an old man with some outdated toys. They had no idea they were standing in front of a retired airline captain who had spent 30 years flying across oceans, and they were about to learn that some things cannot simply be towed away. My name is Richard Callahan, and for most of my adult life, the sky was my home. I started flying when I was young, back when every takeoff still gave me that feeling like I was doing something impossible. I worked my way through the industry, eventually flying commercial routes across the Pacific, spending years with major airlines and later carrying freight through some of the most challenging weather conditions in the world. People often ask me if I ever got tired of flying after all those years. The truth is, no. You don't get tired of something that becomes part of who you are. Flying wasn't just a career. It was the language I understood better than anything else. Up there, everything was simple. You trusted your training, you respected the machine, and you took responsibility for every decision you made. There was no committee deciding what belonged in the sky, no one telling you that something didn't match the right image. When I finally retired, I didn't want a mansion or some fancy vacation home. I wanted space, quiet, a place where I could slow down and keep the connection I had built with aviation alive. That's how I ended up buying 12 acres outside Mesa, Arizona. It wasn't a typical retirement property. There was no perfect lawn, no matching houses, no neighborhood entrance with a giant stone sign. It was just desert, open sky, and enough room for me to build the hangar I had dreamed about for years. Inside that hangar were the 3 aircraft that meant more to me than anything else I owned. The first was a 1944 P-51 Mustang, a true piece of history. Restoring that aircraft took years of patience, money, and countless hours from people who understood that preserving the past mattered. The second was a Navy T-6 Texan trainer. It wasn't as famous as the Mustang, but it represented thousands of pilots who learned the basics before heading into more advanced aircraft. The third was the one I cared about the most, my father's Sturman biplane. My father had trained pilots during World War II, and that airplane was part of his story. I could still remember being a kid and standing beside it while he explained how every sound, every vibration, and every movement meant something. He always told me, an airplane isn't just metal and wires. It carries the people who flew it. I didn't understand that when I was young. I do now. For several years, everything was peaceful. I flew when the weather was good, maintained the aircraft, and enjoyed a quiet retirement. Then the area around me started changing. A new development called Canyon Vista Estates began growing nearby. Beautiful houses went up everywhere. Huge windows, perfect landscaping, community pools, a golf course. Everything designed to look like a magazine cover. At first, I had no issue with it. People wanted a nice place to live, and I respected that. But then the homeowners association started paying attention to my property. The first complaint was about noise. Someone said the aircraft engines disturbed the peaceful atmosphere. I understood that aircraft engines are not exactly silent. I listened. I adjusted my schedule. I avoided unnecessary runs. I tried to be respectful. But then the complaints changed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about sound. It was about appearance. A board member told me the hangar didn't fit the character of the community. That phrase bothered me because what they really meant was, it doesn't look like what we want around here. The person leading the complaints was the HOA president, Melissa Grant. She was smart, organized, and very confident in her position. The kind of person who walked into a room already expecting everyone to agree with her. One afternoon, she arrived at my property holding a thick folder. She didn't come to talk. She came to deliver a decision. She looked past me into the hangar, stared at the aircraft, and said, "Richard, we need to address these storage issues immediately." I looked behind me at 3 fully registered, maintained aircraft and asked, "Storage issues?" She nodded. "These vehicles are creating concerns for the community." I almost laughed because I thought she was making a joke. "They're not vehicles sitting in storage," I told her. "They're aircraft. They're registered, insured, and maintained." She gave me a polite smile, the kind of smile people use when they have already decided your answer doesn't matter. "I understand that, but the board has standards we need residents to follow." That was the first moment I realized this wasn't really about the airplanes. It was about control. The planes were just the easiest target. I had something different, something they couldn't regulate with a color chart or a neighborhood rulebook. A few weeks later, the official notice arrived. The HOA had declared my aircraft inoperable junk vehicles and ordered me to remove them. The fines started immediately, $200 per day. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter over and over, thinking there had to be some mistake. These airplanes had maintenance records, government registrations, insurance policies. They had histories older than many of the homes surrounding me, yet someone had decided they were trash because they didn't like looking at them. Then, one morning, I heard the sound of a truck outside my gate. I walked out and saw a flatbed parked there. The driver looked at his paperwork and asked, "Where's the equipment you're supposed to remove?" I looked at him, then looked back toward my hangar. "You're here for my airplanes?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'm just following the order." That night, I stood alone inside the hangar with the lights off. I placed my hand on the Mustang's wing and thought about everything those airplanes represented. 30 years of flying. My father's memory. The history of people who built, repaired, and flew these machines before me. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if it was worth fighting. Maybe I should sell. Maybe I should move somewhere nobody cared. My daughter even told me, "Dad, you've spent your whole life fighting storms and flying across oceans. You don't have to fight every battle." And part of me knew she was right. I was tired. I wanted peace. But then I looked at my father's Sturman sitting quietly in the corner, and I remembered something he taught me years ago. Some things are not valuable because of what they cost. They're valuable because of what they mean. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't calling a realtor. I wasn't packing boxes. I wasn't giving up. I picked up the phone and called a federal aviation attorney. Because if Canyon Vista Estates wanted to fight, they were about to discover they had picked the wrong hangar to knock on. The attorney I called was named Daniel Whitmore, and unlike the HOA board members who looked at my aircraft and saw an eyesore, Daniel looked at the paperwork and immediately understood what they had stepped into. He came out to my hangar 2 days later, walked around the Mustang, checked the registration documents, looked through the maintenance records, and spent almost an hour standing beside my father's old Sturman. He wasn't just reading papers. He was listening to the story behind them. Finally, he closed the folder in his hand and said, "Richard, they made a very common mistake. They confused having authority with having unlimited authority." That sentence was the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe again. Daniel explained that my aircraft were not abandoned vehicles sitting in a backyard. They were federally registered aircraft, maintained under aviation standards, and recognized as historically significant pieces of aviation history. The HOA could create rules about landscaping, paint colors, fences, and neighborhood appearance, but they couldn't simply declare a legally protected aircraft to be garbage because they didn't like seeing it. "They can have an opinion," Daniel told me. "They cannot rewrite reality." We prepared a response letter that was impossible to ignore. It included FAA registration documents, maintenance certifications, insurance records, and historical documentation connected to the aircraft. We also included a clear statement from my attorney explaining that any attempt to remove the planes would create serious legal consequences. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, looking at all those documents spread out in front of me. For years, I had carried logbooks across oceans. I had signed thousands of aviation forms. I knew paperwork mattered, but I never imagined one day paperwork would be the thing protecting my father's memory from a homeowners association. The letter was delivered on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the flatbed truck that had been waiting outside my gate disappeared. The daily fines stopped. The phone calls stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe that was the end of it. I was wrong. People don't always accept losing, especially when they are used to everyone following their orders. The board didn't remove the aircraft, but they changed tactics. Suddenly, neighbors who had never spoken to me started making comments when I walked by. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others looked at me like I was the problem. One afternoon, a man from 2 streets over stopped near my driveway and said, "You know, most people move into a community because they want to belong." I looked at him and replied, "I thought belonging meant being part of a community, not pretending everyone has to be identical." He didn't answer. He just walked away. Then came the moment that hurt more than any fine or legal threat. One morning, I opened my hangar door and found someone had spray painted the words "Move your junk" across the front. I stood there silently for a long time. I've been through engine failures, emergency landings, and situations where every decision mattered in seconds. But that simple message written on my own property hit differently. It wasn't about an airplane anymore. It was personal. My granddaughter Emily came by that afternoon. She was 9 years old and loved sitting in the cockpit with me while I explained the instruments. She looked at the door and asked, "Grandpa, why would someone call your airplanes junk?" I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a child that sometimes people can look at something beautiful and only see what they want to see? I told her, some people don't know the difference between old and valuable. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't really understand. Honestly, neither did I. I couldn't understand how a machine that represented sacrifice, courage, and history could become the target of someone's frustration. But the HOA wasn't finished. A few months later, they filed a lawsuit against me. Their argument was simple. They claimed the hangar and aircraft damaged the character of the neighborhood and violated community expectations. They hired attorneys, prepared documents, and acted like this was just another battle they could win through persistence. What they didn't realize was that I had spent 30 years flying in an industry where details mattered. You don't ignore a checklist at 35,000 feet. You don't guess when lives are involved. And I wasn't going to guess now. Daniel prepared every piece of evidence carefully. He presented the aircraft records, the legal protections, the history, and the facts. Meanwhile, the HOA attorney kept returning to the same argument. But the community doesn't want them there. The judge finally looked up from the paperwork and asked a simple question. "Are these aircraft legal?" The attorney hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." But the judge stopped him. "Then we need to discuss facts, not preferences." That was the moment I knew the entire case was changing. The hearing lasted several hours, but the outcome became clear. The court recognized that the HOA had overstepped its authority. The lawsuit was dismissed, and the board was ordered to cover my legal costs. As we walked out of the courthouse, Daniel shook my hand and said, "Richard, they weren't fighting your airplanes. They were fighting the fact that they couldn't control them." I thought about that for a long time, because he was right. The Mustang, the Texan, and my father Sturman had been sitting there peacefully for years. The conflict only started when someone decided they had the power to decide what mattered. But the story didn't end with a courtroom victory. The most surprising part happened almost a year later, when the same HOA board that once called my aircraft junk came back to my door with a completely different request. I still remember the morning Melissa Grant showed up at my gate again. The same woman who had once stood there with a folder full of violations, telling me my aircraft were nothing more than unwanted junk, was now standing in the exact same spot with a completely different expression on her face. There was no confidence this time, no lecture, no carefully prepared speech about community standards. She looked like someone who had finally realized the person standing in front of her was never the problem. She was. She looked down at the folder in her hands, then back at me, and said, "Richard, the board wanted to talk to you about something." I almost smiled because after everything that happened, I expected another battle. Another complaint, another attempt to find some new rule they could use against me. But instead, she surprised me. "We were wondering if you would consider doing a flyover for our 4th of July celebration." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. I looked at her, then looked back at the hangar behind me where the same airplanes they had spent months trying to remove were sitting quietly under their covers. The Mustang, the Texan, my father's Sturman, the junk they wanted gone had somehow become the centerpiece of their biggest community event of the year. I asked her one question. "You mean the same aircraft your board said didn't belong here?" She paused. "We understand now that we were wrong about them." That sentence probably took more courage than she expected, because people who are used to having authority don't often admit when they crossed a line. I didn't celebrate. I didn't yell. I just nodded because, after all those months, I finally heard the one thing I wanted from the beginning. Not permission, not approval, just recognition that these airplanes were never the problem. I told her I would consider the request, but I had a few conditions. First, the event needed to cover the fuel and operational costs because keeping historic aircraft flying is not a cheap hobby. Second, I wanted a written apology published in the community newsletter explaining that the aircraft were not abandoned junk, but legally registered, maintained historic aircraft. Melissa looked uncomfortable when I mentioned the apology. She glanced away for a second, and I knew exactly what she was thinking. Paying for fuel was easy. Admitting they were wrong was the hard part. But eventually she said, "I think that's fair." And honestly, That was the moment I knew things had really changed. Not because they invited me to their event, but because someone who once saw me as a problem finally saw me as a neighbor. A few weeks later, the apology appeared in the newsletter. It wasn't a dramatic front-page confession. It wasn't filled with emotional words. It was short, professional, and probably written by someone who still wasn't thrilled about admitting defeat. But it was there. And sometimes, after a long fight, a small acknowledgement means more than a big speech. Then came July 4th. I arrived at the hangar before sunrise. The desert was quiet. The sky was still dark, with only a faint orange line appearing over the mountains. I opened the doors and stood there for a moment, looking at the airplanes. I've flown thousands of hours in my life. That morning felt different. It wasn't about being a pilot. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about understanding why I fought so hard in the first place. I walked over to my father's storeman and placed my hand on the wing. I thought about him as a young man, climbing into that cockpit during a completely different time in America. He wasn't thinking about history. He was just doing his part. But decades later, that same airplane was still telling his story. I started the engine, and that familiar sound rolled across the desert. The same sound that once brought complaints was now bringing people outside with cameras and smiles. The Mustang lifted into the morning sky first, followed by the Texan and the Sturman. We flew over Copper Ridge Estates, banking slowly above the golf course and the perfect rows of expensive homes. I could see families pointing upward, kids running across lawns. Even some of the neighbors who had complained the loudest were standing there watching. And I have to admit, there was a small part of me that enjoyed that moment. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted them to feel embarrassed, but because sometimes the best response isn't an argument. Sometimes the best response is simply letting people see the truth for themselves. From the cockpit, everything looked different. The houses looked smaller. The arguments looked smaller. The months of stress looked smaller. Up there, all I could think about was how strange life can be. One year, people were trying to remove those airplanes. The next year, they were selling tickets to watch them fly. The same board that called them an embarrassment was now using them as a symbol of community pride. But the funny thing about history is that it doesn't need everyone's approval to matter. Those airplanes were important before the HOA understood them. They were valuable before anyone admitted it. They carried meaning long before anyone put a price tag on them. Today, the aircraft are still in my hangar. I still polish the aluminum. I still check every detail before a flight. I still get that same feeling every time the engine starts. It reminds me that some things are worth preserving, even when other people don't understand why. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about aviation law or HOA rules. It was about how easily people can judge something they don't know. To someone walking past my property, those airplanes were old machines taking up space. To me, they were my father's memories, my career, and a connection to generations of people who believed the sky was something worth reaching for. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the HOA went too far by trying to remove the aircraft? Or do you believe homeowners associations should have the power to protect the appearance of their communities? Where should the line be between shared neighborhood standards and someone's personal history? Tell me your opinion in the comments, because this is the kind of story where both sides have something to say. If you enjoyed this story about standing your ground, protecting what matters, and seeing justice finally catch up, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the most valuable things we own aren't the things sitting in our bank accounts. Sometimes they're the memories, the stories, and the pieces of the past that we refuse to let disappear.